I never imagined my life would change the way it did after I started working at the small middle school tucked away in the suburbs of a quiet American town. Growing up, I'd always been an introvert, shy, a little withdrawn. I struggled through my own school years. But I had dreams, aspirations of making a difference in the world. Becoming a teacher wasn't part of my original plan. But life has a funny way of steering us toward paths we never considered. In my case, it wasn't just about imparting knowledge, it was about discovering that the smallest acts of kindness could reverberate through the lives of young students, changing their paths and even my own in the most unexpected ways. It was my first year at the school, and I was still getting used to the flow of things. The hallways smelled of books, chalk, and that distinct teenage energy. Every morning, as I walked past the rows of lockers, there was a subtle tension in the air, the quiet struggle of kids who felt too much but shared too little. I remember looking into their eyes, recognizing that same uncertainty I once carried with me. They were on the edge of figuring out who they were, yet so unsure of the next step. At first, I kept to myself, focused on my lesson plans, determined to be the kind of teacher that stayed within the lines. The syllabus was my map, and I intended to follow it rigorously. But that's the thing about teaching, no matter how meticulously you prepare, reality has a way of intruding, reshaping everything you thought you knew. It wasn't long before I realized that teaching went far beyond textbooks and exams. It was about understanding the subtle struggles students faced, those quiet battles no one else saw. One morning, I noticed a girl sitting alone in the cafeteria. She sat hunched over her tray, picking at her food with a vacant expression on her face. Her name was Emily, a quiet 8th grader who rarely spoke up in class. There was something about her that reminded me of myself, something vulnerable, fragile. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I found myself glancing over at her more often, sensing that she was in a place of silent turmoil. That afternoon, as I packed up my things to leave, I passed by her again, sitting in the corner of the school library. She was pretending to read a book, but her eyes were distant, lost in a world that wasn't on the pages in front of her. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should intrude. Something inside urged me to say something, but I convinced myself that it wasn't my place. She was just a student, and I was just her teacher. What difference could a few words from me make? That thought lingered with me throughout the night, tugging at my conscience. I realized then that teaching wasn't just about subjects and homework, it was about seeing the unseen, hearing the unspoken cries for help. And so, the next day, I made a conscious decision to reach out, not just to Emily, but to every student who seemed to need it. It started small, like dipping a toe in the water. I would walk through the halls with a simple intention, to acknowledge those who were often overlooked. A smile, a good morning, a compliment on someone's backpack. It felt insignificant at first, but soon, I started noticing subtle changes. Students began to respond, not immediately, but over time. The walls they'd built around themselves began to crack. Just a little. I saw Emily again in the cafeteria a few days later. This time, I decided not to hesitate. I walked over, sat down across from her, and smiled. "Hey, Emily. How's it going?" Her eyes flicked up at me, startled, as if unsure whether I was really talking to her. Okay. I guess," she mumbled. "Your history project was really good. I could tell you put a lot of effort into it." I said. I meant it, too. Her project had been thoughtful, detailed, and far more insightful than most of her classmates. She shrugged, but I saw the smallest hint of a smile tug at the corners of her lips. "Thanks," she whispered. It wasn't much, just a brief conversation, but I could see that it meant something to her. It was a seed planted, and I hoped it would grow. Over the next few weeks, I made it a point to check in with her regularly. It wasn't always easy. Some days she barely said 2 words. But other days, she opened up just a little more. I started to learn about her life outside of school, about her parents' divorce, the bullying she faced from kids who thought she was too quiet, too weird. It was heartbreaking. And yet, I realized that just by listening, by being there, I was offering her something she desperately needed, validation. But it wasn't just Emily. There were others. 2 kids like David, who struggled with reading but never wanted to ask for help because he didn't want to seem dumb, or Maya, who was constantly skipping class because she was too anxious to face her peers. Slowly, I began to realize that these small acts of kindness, acknowledging their existence, offering a kind word, were ripples in the water, spreading outward in ways I couldn't always see. Sometimes it felt like I was merely scratching the surface of the pain and hardship these kids faced. But I learned to appreciate the moments when they let their guards down. Even for a second. It was in those moments that I felt like I was making a difference. No matter how small. As the school year progressed, I could sense a growing tension in the air. It was subtle at first. Like the way a storm gathers on the horizon. Unseen but felt. The kids seemed more on edge than usual, snapping at each other. Falling behind in their work. Drifting off in class. It wasn't just one or two students, it was everyone. Even the teachers looked more worn down than usual. Their usual enthusiasm dulled by the weight of too much responsibility and too little time. I tried to keep up the small acts of kindness. But it felt like I was swimming against the current. Every day brought new challenges. One of the students, Ben, had started acting out in class. He was disruptive. Talking back. And refusing to do his work. It wasn't like him. Ben had always been quiet. Respectful, one of those kids who faded into the background. Never causing trouble. But now, it was like he had reached a breaking point. And the anger he had kept bottled up for so long was spilling over. I remember one particular day when things came to a head. Ben was sitting at the back of the class, refusing to participate in the lesson. I could see the frustration in his eyes. The way he clenched his fists under the desk. Ben, I said gently. Is everything okay? Why do you even care? He snapped. His voice laced with bitterness. His words hit me harder than I expected. It was a question I had asked myself so many times. Why did I care? Why did I go out of my way to notice these kids? To try and make a difference when it often felt like nothing was changing? For a moment, I didn't have an answer. But then I looked at him. Really looked at him. And I saw the pain behind his anger. I care because I know what it's like to feel like no one does. I said quietly. He didn't respond right away. But something in his expression softened. It was a small moment. But it reminded me that even when the storm feels overwhelming, even when it feels like you're not making a difference, you are. The small acts of kindness I'd been offering weren't about fixing everything or making all the pain go away. They were about showing these kids that someone saw them. That someone cared. And sometimes, that was enough. By the end of the school year, I could feel the weight of everything I'd learned pressing down on me. The kindness I had tried to spread had rippled outward, touching more lives than I realized. I started to see the echo of those small acts of kindness in unexpected ways. Emily, who had once been so withdrawn, began helping other students with their work. David, who had struggled with reading, volunteered to read aloud in class one day. His voice trembling but determined. But perhaps the most unexpected change came from Maya. The girl who had once skipped class out of anxiety had become a peer mentor, offering support to other students who were struggling. It wasn't something I had orchestrated, it wasn't something I had even suggested. It just happened. Naturally. Like a flower blooming after a long winter. And it was then that I realized the true power of kindness. It wasn't just about the immediate impact, it was about the ripple effect. The way it spread and grew in ways you couldn't always predict. Looking back, I see now that the acts of kindness I offered were like seeds planted in the hearts of these students. Some of them took root right away, while others took longer to bloom. But in the end, they all grew. In one way or another. And in the process, I changed. Too. I became more patient. More understanding. More willing to see the pain behind the behavior. I realized that kindness wasn't about fixing people or making everything perfect, it was about showing up. Day after day. Even when it felt like you weren't making a difference. It was about believing that every small act mattered. Even when you couldn't see the results right away. As the last day of school approached, I found myself standing in the empty classroom, looking at the rows of desks, each one representing a life I had touched in some way. I knew that my time with these students was coming to an end. But I also knew that the kindness I had shared would continue to echo in their lives. Just as it had in mine. In the end, it wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It was about the small moments, the smiles. The words of encouragement. The times when I had simply listened. Those were the moments that made the biggest difference. Not just in their lives, but in mine as well. And that's the thing about kindness. It doesn't just change the people who receive it, it changes the people who give it. Too. It reminds us that we are all connected. That every small act has the power to make a big difference. I left the classroom that day feeling a sense of peace, knowing that the seeds I had planted would continue to grow long after I was gone. And as I walked down the empty hallway one last time, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that I had made a difference, in ways both big and small. Because in the end, it's the small acts of kindness that make the biggest difference in the world. And I was grateful to have been a part of that, even in the smallest of ways.